Today, we are talking about The Talk of the Town and The More the Merrier. Two films starring Jean Arthur. I get to wax poetic about Jean Arthur again. My favorite pastime on this channel is analyzing, exploring, and talking about Jean Arthur, whom I consider to be my cinematic twin. And both of these films were directed by George Stevens, who would also direct her final film appearance in Shane, which is a delightful and deeply confrontational and slightly morbid Western. Yeah, these came near the end of her contract over at Columbia, over her kind of tortured time serving under Harry Cohn. In fact, when she did maybe like two more movies after this, one with John Wayne, and I think another with Joel McCrea, and she ran when she was done with her contract. She ran through the studio street screaming, "I'm free! I'm free!" But these two movies are fun. George Stevens is a pretty interesting director. He also directed Swing Time, so he knows how to frame a scene. He's a very capable and skilled director. Talk of the Town came out first in 1942, and I think it's a very good film. Um, I'm glad I rewatched it because the first time I ever watched The Talk of the Town, I was kind of underwhelmed by it. Watching it again, I am pretty deeply charmed by the film. And if you remember my Only Angels Have Wings video, another film she did with Cary Grant, I talked about how Jean Arthur thought that Cary Grant was kind of was being kind of a bitch and was trying to upstage her at every turn. Um, from what I've read about the talk of the town and the film's final scene, Jean Arthur upstages him, gets a slight bit of petty revenge on Cary Grant, and I relate to that deeply. Yes, the talk of the town stars Jean Arthur, Cary Grant, and Ronald Colman, and it's got a lot of fun screwball hijinks. I think it's a pretty decent example of the new 40s romantic comedy heroine and how that demarcates, how that's delineated, how there's a line, a separation between the cynical and wisecracking screwball heroines of the 30s that Jean Arthur and like Carol Lombard I think popularized most significantly in films like Hands Across the Table, and of course like Mr. Smith and Easy Living for Arthur and Lombard respectively. Um, the new 40s romantic comedy heroine was a bit more tamed, and a bit more ordinary, less confrontational, and that's kind of tragic. And I'm kind of that kind of sucks. It kind of sucks in a big way. But why I'm bringing all that up is because Jean Arthur, her personality just shines through in everything. Right, there's a scene in the Talk of the Town where she's looking in front of a mirror doing a Veronica Lake and Katharine Hepburn impression, wearing Ronald Colman's pajamas and using her long hair to kind of pretend she has a mustache and going "lovely darling," like things like that. And her personality just shines through. It was unstoppable. So even when I think like studio wide or like Hollywood all over were trying to kind of tame the more cynical and disobedient screwball heroine, Jean Arthur's kind of radicalness still slipped through. She was a radical, I think, in every way, but politically as well as her sensitivities were radical, and that's really where I relate to her so much. She was the actress that nobody knew, but her personality completely just, you could not contain it, and you definitely couldn't tame it. And I think the Talk of the Town is a pretty charming and altogether a delightful sort of film. And I like it so much more than Only Angels Have Wings. I think that Cary Grant and Jean Arthur have pretty great chemistry in this film. And yeah, altogether very charming. The More the Merrier. The More the Merrier is phenomenal. I think this is one of Jean Arthur's greatest roles. I think it's one of her best films. I think it's probably George Stevens's best movie, better than A Place in the Sun. I think that this film right here is cinematic gold. Um, probably one of the last great screwball comedies, honestly. uh, there are so many magic moments in that movie. Once again, we get Charles Coburn paired with Jean Arthur. So, like, she had just done The Devil and Miss Jones, and they have remarkable kind of like father daughter or grandfather granddaughter chemistry together, and it's wonderful. I think this is her third time working with Joel McCrea, and I love their chemistry so much. This is a film that you can laugh out loud at, a film that you can feel just whimsical about, a film that gets you feeling like a goofball and ready to fall in love in the most outlandish and silly sort of way. Um, I love it so much that it's catastrophic. I think that The More the Merrier is a devastatingly funny and touching film, and clever too. The script is very, very, very good. Yeah, Robert Russell uh, wrote this specifically for Jean Arthur because she had been denying every script and like pissing off Harry Cohn because she had a deep fear of making bad films, and she just refused to do it after a while, and that meant that everybody hated her, especially Harry Cohn at the studio. So Frank Ross, her husband at the time, um, and Robert Russell came together and wrote a screenplay specifically for Jean Arthur, and Harry Cohn allowed it to be made, and it turned out to be beautiful. And Charles Coburn, I think, took home an Oscar for his performance as Mr. Dingle. And Constance Milligan, who is played by Jean Arthur, this was the only Oscar nomination she ever received. She was snubbed, um, mostly due to some really problematic shit, actually. Like, some say that she was snubbed because like her feud with studio boss of Columbia, Harry Cohn, was so public that geez, that everybody knew about it, and that by nominating her, they would be kind of saying that this sort of poor behavior was okay. You know, Jean Arthur had every right to hate Harry Cohn as much as she did, and I think that that's kind of insanity. Another reason that she was snubbed is because, like I said, she's the actress nobody knew. She wasn't extremely popular, especially amongst her peers. But I guess you could not deny the more the merrier here. And another reason why she was nominated this time is because Harry Cohn started to become unpopular, and they wanted to kind of send a fuck you Harry Cohn's way. They nominated her. She lost. There's a fun anecdote about how her and Joan Fontaine were nominated the same year, and they both lost, and they both had a pretty nice night that night at the bar. They got a little intoxicated, and what what was usual for Arthur, sadly, unfortunately, but which I relate to deeply, that Joan Fontaine and Jean Arthur had such a great night as Oscar losers, getting drunk with their husbands, and they plan to hang out and cook and have fun and drink again sometime. Jean Arthur was to go over to Joan Fontaine's house, but Jean Arthur never showed, which was the regular for her. The more the merrier, I think, is a pretty just irresistible film for me. Um, and I think it's pretty inventive, not only in terms of composition, because I think that it probably does have George Stevens's greatest visuals in the film. That there's a lot of kind of beautiful moments when we're seeing characters talk to each other through over a wall in their apartment, through the windows. There's a lot of great kind of poetics going on, romantic poetics, comedic poetics going on throughout the entire film. But I also think it's very inventive in the terms of rom-coms. I think that this is probably the film that best operates as the bridge between the more kind of radical screwball comedies to what we know of rom-coms today. I think this is the greatest bridge to the modernization of the romantic comedy in popular cinema. And you can see it, and it feels so innovative too. Um, and it feels remarkably effortlessly so. It just feels so innovative. And I think it's doing a lot of like heavy lifting to push kind of those wackier, those more radical, those more socially significant features of the screwball comedy into the modern rom-com, because as I mentioned, I think this is why I laid this as my foundation for this analysis, is that like in the 40s they were starting to tame romantic comedy heroines, and I think that's a pretty fucked up and stupid thing for them to have done. But by doing that, you're also kind of changing what the genre is, because screwball comedies are largely defined by their cynical, wisecracking, and disobedient uh, female leads, female heroines. And if you remove that um, from the romantic cinema, then you are no longer making screwball comedies. So I think that a tragedy, a real tragedy, could have happened to cinema, where we kind of lost the best parts of romantic comedies altogether. But the more the merrier, figured out a way through Jean Arthur, through her personality, through her idiosyncrasies, through her she's fucking so sexy in this movie too. So through her sexiness, and through her that kind of transcendent metaphysical quality that made her so magnetic to a lot of people. Like, she has a gravitational sort of appeal in quite a few different ways. Um, Through Jean Arthur, we're able to kind of keep a part of the screwball heroine intact, as the genre not only innovated and moved forward, but also seemed to take a few steps back in terms of their female heroines. So we were able to kind of keep the radical qualities of the screwball heroine in a different sort of way. And this is where screwball comedies really became rom-coms. This is where screwball comedies became modern in a very large way. And I'm just so thankful to Jean Arthur and George Stevens for being able to hold on to uh, to those radical qualities of screwball heroines, um, in very intriguing and desirable ways. I think it's one of the most important films in cinema history, but it's not recognized as such. And I think it did so much for the romantic comedy genre, and I thank God that we still have some of those screwball elements, because you can still see screwball elements to this day. And I think that had it not been for the More the Merrier, those more radical qualities of screwball women would have been erased. We would have witnessed an intense erasure of those radical qualities from romantic comedy heroines. And it's just so funny, and damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. It's irresistible. It's easily one of Jean Arthur's greatest films. It's one of her greatest performances. I still think her greatest performance is as Clarissa Saunders in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but Constance Milligan might be a very close second. No lie, no joke. This movie is phenomenal, and more eyes should be on it at all times. I watch this movie pretty regularly. I would say I watch it 2 or 3 times a year, and I've done so for the last couple of years. Um, it's just so funny and charming, and makes me want to go out and talk to girls and fall in love, man, and like have my own personal comedic hijinks, And I think that's the best thing that a romantic comedy or a screwball one can do for you. And I love interacting with the film's themes and the film's characters and the jokes within it. I love the film. And I think that George Stevens, he understood Jean Arthur really well, because just like how Jean Arthur was pretty methodical when it came to her acting, she put a great deal of thought into it. She probably overthought her characters, which once again I relate to on a very sensitive level, a hypersensitive level. George Stevens was also very slow and methodical with his composition, with his filmmaking, and I think Jean did call George Stevens her favorite director ultimately, um, which means she enjoyed working for George Stevens a little bit more than she enjoyed working for Capra. But for both Capra and George Stevens, they considered Jean Arthur their favorite actress. Um, what George Stevens said of her acting abilities or her comedic abilities were like, it's just truth. Comedy isn't funny if it's not truth. And I think he's onto something, and I think he's slightly right when it comes to Jean. There's a truthfulness to her quirks, to her radical qualities, to her vulnerabilities and sensitivities. There's a truthfulness to it. And I think she was one of cinema's greatest comedians. I think she was one of cinema's greatest actresses. Um, and I think her performance in The More the Merrier is legendary. I love this woman. I love this film. And this is a great double feature. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead.